On the morning of December 7th, 1944, Oberst Friedrich Weber stood in the command post of his armored regiment near the frost-covered fields of eastern France, watching through binoculars as another column of American armor rolled into view. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and his breath formed small clouds in the air as he lowered the field glasses and turned to his officers with a confident smile. These American machines, he believed, were nothing more than mobile coffins wrapped in inadequate steel, vastly inferior to the engineering prowess of German armored vehicles. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Weber could not have imagined was that within 72 hours, his entire understanding of modern armored conflict would be shattered, not by superior German engineering, but by something far more terrifying, the overwhelming abundance of American industrial might. Weber was not an inexperienced officer making amateur assessments. At 42 years old, he had commanded armored units across multiple theaters, from the Eastern campaigns to North Africa, accumulating 3 years of continuous combat experience. His regiment had faced Soviet armor, British Crusaders, and now these American Shermans that seemed to multiply across the landscape like mechanical insects. In his leather-bound field journal, he had written detailed observations about enemy equipment, and his notes on the American medium tank were particularly dismissive. The Sherman, he had concluded, possessed armor that could be penetrated by most German anti-tank weapons, a height profile that made it an easy target, and a gasoline engine that turned it into a funeral pyre when struck. His crews had nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson, after the American cigarette lighter, because it lit on the first strike. Standing beside Weber that December morning was Hauptmann Klaus Zimmermann, a 34-year-old veteran who commanded one of the regiment's remaining heavy tank companies. Zimmermann had just returned from a reconnaissance patrol and was reviewing maps spread across the wooden table in their makeshift headquarters, a partially damaged farmhouse that still smelled of old hay and gunpowder. The walls were covered with tactical maps marked with red and blue symbols, indicating known positions. Zimmermann pointed to a series of markings representing American units. "We counted at least 40 of those tin cans moving up through the valley," Zimmermann said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had seen enemy armor destroyed many times before. "They seem to be concentrating for a push toward our positions. Should we request reinforcement from division?" Weber shook his head, pouring himself ersatz coffee from a dented metal pot that sat warming on a small stove. The bitter liquid tasted like burned grain, but it was hot. 40 Shermans against our remaining vehicles? That is hardly a fair fight for them. Each of our heavy tanks is worth at least 5 of theirs in combat value. We have superior armor, superior weapons, superior tactical training. Let them come. What Weber did not mention, because he preferred not to dwell on such uncomfortable facts, was that his regiment now possessed only 11 operational armored vehicles of various types. Mechanical breakdowns, lack of spare parts, and previous engagements had reduced his once formidable force to a shadow of its former strength. 3 heavy tanks, 6 medium tanks, and 2 self-propelled guns constituted his entire armored capability. Meanwhile, the American forces gathering in the valley represented just one small portion of a vast mechanized army that seemed to have no limit to its resources. Lieutenant Hans Müller, her 26-year-old tank commander, who had joined the regiment only 4 months earlier, entered the command post carrying a wooden crate filled with the morning's ration distribution. The young officer had a thin face marked by exhaustion and a perpetual expression of worry that Weber found irritating. Müller set down the crate and saluted. "Sir, the fuel situation is becoming critical," Müller reported. "We have enough for perhaps 2 days of normal operations, maybe less if we engage in extended maneuvers. The supply convoy that was supposed to arrive yesterday never appeared." Weber waved his hand dismissively. "The supply situation is always critical, Müller. It has been critical for months, yet we continue to fight. We continue to win tactical engagements. One does not defeat inferior equipment with superior logistics. One defeats it with superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence." Müller nodded but did not look convinced. He had heard similar speeches before, usually right before their unit was forced to retreat or consolidate positions. The young officer had begun to notice a pattern: German tactical victories that somehow never translated into strategic advantage, small successes that were immediately overshadowed by the enemy's ability to replace losses and continue advancing. Throughout that day, Weber conducted his usual command duties with the precision and confidence expected of a senior officer. He reviewed intelligence reports indicating that American forces were preparing for a general offensive across the sector. He inspected defensive positions and discussed firing solutions with his remaining tank commanders. He maintained the appearance of a leader who understood the situation completely and had everything under control. But late that afternoon, something happened that began to crack the foundation of his certainty. A junior enlisted man, a radio operator named Stefan Koch, hurried into the command post with a message that had just been decoded. Koch was 19 years old, barely old enough to shave, and he delivered the message with the nervous energy of someone bearing bad news. "Sir, communication from regiment on our northern flank. They report being engaged by American armor in overwhelming numbers. They counted over 80 enemy tanks in the assault. They are requesting immediate support." Weber took the message and read it carefully. 80 tanks in a single engagement against one regiment. He did his mental arithmetic, even assuming significant exaggeration, which was common in combat reports from units under pressure. The Americans were committing armor in quantities that seemed strategically wasteful. Why would they risk such numbers against a single defensive position? What kind of military logic justified such excessive force concentration? Zimmerman, who had been studying the map, looked up with a thoughtful expression. "If they can afford to use 80 tanks on our northern neighbor, how many do you think they will use against us? We are holding a more strategically important position." Weber did not answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the grey December sky. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of artillery fire, a constant background noise that had become so familiar it was almost comforting in its predictability. 100 tanks, 150? The numbers seemed absurd, impossible to support logistically. Yet the evidence kept accumulating that the Americans operated under different rules that made no sense to a military mind trained in resource conservation and efficient deployment. That evening, as darkness settled over the frozen landscape, Weber sat alone in a small room he had claimed as his personal quarters. A single candle provided flickering light as he wrote in his journal. The entry began with his usual confident assessments of tactical situations, but toward the end, a note of uncertainty crept in. He wrote about the American production capacity, about intelligence reports suggesting that factories across the ocean were producing tanks, aircraft, and vehicles in quantities that seemed to belong to fantasy rather than reality. He wrote the numbers: 5,000 heavy bombers per month, thousands of tanks rolling off assembly lines in cities with strange names like Detroit and Pittsburgh. Then he crossed out that last paragraph, as if erasing the words could erase the implications. The attack began at 0400 hours the next morning, announced by the whistling scream of artillery shells that turned the darkness into a landscape of fire and concussion. Weber, who had learned to sleep through anything after 3 years of war, woke instantly and was at the command post within minutes, pulling on his uniform jacket as he ran through the cold. Zimmerman was already there, coordinating with forward observers and trying to determine the scope of the bombardment. "This is preparation fire for an assault," Zimmerman said, shouting to be heard over the explosions. "Standard American doctrine: 30 minutes of artillery, then the armor moves forward with infantry support." "We should expect them around 0430. Weber nodded, his mind already working through defensive options. He ordered all available vehicles to their assigned positions, anti-tank guns to prepare for engagement, and infantry to take up positions in the prepared defensive network they had spent weeks constructing. Every piece was moving into place like a well-rehearsed performance. The German defenders, despite their reduced numbers, were professionals who knew their craft. As the artillery fire lifted exactly on schedule, the first reports began arriving from forward observation posts. The radio operator's voice, normally steady, carried an edge of disbelief as he relayed the information. "Sir, forward position Delta reports enemy armor approaching in strength. They count. They are asking for confirmation. They count over 120 vehicles moving up the valley. Request confirmation of count. Weber grabbed the radio handset himself. Delta, this is Oberst Weber. Confirm your count. You are reporting 120 enemy vehicles. A different voice came through, older, more experienced. This is Delta Position, Commander. Sir, I have been observing enemy armor for 2 years. I know how to count. I see 120, perhaps 130 American medium tanks advancing in multiple waves. They are not attempting stealth or surprise. They are simply coming straight at us in overwhelming strength. And, sir, there is something else. Behind the first wave, I can see another wave forming, and behind that, more vehicles staging. This is not a standard assault. This is... I do not know what this is. Weber felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he forced his voice to remain calm and authoritative. All positions, this is command. Enemy approaching in strength. Engage when they enter effective range. Use cover and concealment. Make every shot count. We have quality and tactical position on our side. They have quantity. We will see which matters more. The battle that followed would be described later in Weber's journal as the most educational 72 hours of his military career. The first engagement began well enough. German anti-tank guns, positioned in excellent defensive terrain, began engaging the advancing American armor at ranges of over 1,000 meters. Within the first 20 minutes, 8 American tanks had been stopped, several burning, their crews evacuating where possible. Weber, watching from an observation position, felt a moment of satisfaction. This was the pattern he knew. But then something happened that should not have happened. The American tanks did not stop. They did not pause to regroup. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, absorbing losses that would have caused any rational commander to halt the assault. Zimmermann, standing beside Weber, spoke what they were both thinking. They do not care about losses. Look at them. Every time we destroy one, 3 more keep advancing. This is not a tactical assault. This is industrial warfare. They are using tanks the way we use artillery shells, as expendable resources to achieve an objective. The second wave of American armor hit the German positions like a steel tide, where a German commander would have seen 8 destroyed tanks and ordered a tactical reassessment. The American commander simply committed more vehicles. Shermans began flanking the anti-tank positions, using their superior numbers to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. For every German gun position that destroyed 2 or 3 American tanks, 5 more Shermans would maneuver to suppress or bypass that position. It was mathematics, cold and brutal. The Germans had 11 armored vehicles and perhaps 20 anti-tank guns. The Americans were committing over 150 tanks to this single engagement, and intelligence reports suggested more armor was being held in reserve. By mid-morning, Weber's carefully prepared defensive line was beginning to fracture. Not because of tactical failures, his troops were fighting with skill and determination, but because the Americans could afford to trade 3 Shermans for every German vehicle destroyed and still maintain overwhelming numerical superiority. Müller, commanding one of the remaining medium tanks, reported his situation over the radio with barely controlled panic in his voice. "We have destroyed 5 enemy tanks, sir. 5 confirmed. But they keep coming. Every position we take, they flank with more tanks. Every time we relocate, they have another platoon waiting. It is like fighting the ocean. You can bail out water, but the ocean does not care. There is always more water." Weber had no good answer. He ordered Müller to fall back to a secondary position to preserve the vehicle for future engagements. But even as he gave the order, he understood its futility. There would be no future engagements if this battle was lost. There would only be retreat, consolidation, and eventually another battle where the same pattern would repeat. German tactical excellence being slowly, methodically ground down by American industrial capacity. By afternoon, the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. German ammunition was running critically low. Every anti-tank gun was rationing shots, trying to make each round count. The American tanks, meanwhile, seemed to fire freely, suppressing German positions with high explosive rounds, forcing crews to keep their heads down rather than engaging effectively. And behind the American armor, Weber could now see through his binoculars what truly terrified him. Supply trucks, recovery vehicles, repair units, all moving forward in a massive logistical train that suggested the Americans could sustain this level of operations indefinitely. Zimmermann approached with the latest casualty reports and resource assessment. His uniform was dirty, his face streaked with soot from a near miss that had demolished part of the command post. "We have lost 6 of our 11 armored vehicles, 3 destroyed completely, 3 damaged beyond field repair. Our anti-tank guns are down to an average of 7 rounds each. Fuel is almost exhausted. Sir, I must recommend we order a withdrawal while we still have the capability to disengage." Weber looked at the map one more time, at the red symbols representing German positions being slowly encircled by blue American markers. Every principle of tactical command he had learned, every doctrine he had studied, suggested that Zimmermann was correct. But giving the order to withdraw felt like admitting something more profound than a simple tactical defeat. It felt like acknowledging that everything he believed about warfare, about the superiority of quality over quantity, about tactical excellence overcoming material disadvantage, was fundamentally wrong in this new kind of conflict. Before he could respond, a massive explosion shook the building. Dust fell from the ceiling and several maps fell off the walls. Koch, the young radio operator, was shouting into his handset, trying to maintain contact with forward positions. When he turned to Weber, his face was pale. "Sir, our heavy tank company reports they are surrounded. 20 American tanks have them in a pocket. They are requesting permission to attempt a breakout." Weber felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like physical pressure. 3 heavy tanks. His best remaining vehicles trapped by an enemy that could afford to use 20 vehicles to destroy 3. The mathematics was absurd, wasteful, irrational, and completely effective. He gave the only order possible. Tell them to fight their way out if they can. If they cannot, crews should abandon the vehicles to prevent capture. Over the next hour, Weber listened to radio reports describing the disintegration of his regiment's defensive line. One by one, positions fell silent or reported being overrun or encircled. The Americans were not achieving quick, decisive breakthroughs like a German armored thrust might attempt. Instead, they were simply applying pressure everywhere simultaneously, using their numerical superiority to attack from so many directions that defensive coordination became impossible. It was like watching a demonstration of a mathematical principle. When one side has 15 times the resources of the other, individual skill and tactical excellence matter less with each passing hour. By late afternoon, Weber gave the order he had never imagined giving that morning. "All units, prepare for general withdrawal. We will fall back to secondary positions and regroup. All vehicles and equipment that cannot be moved will be destroyed to prevent capture. This is not a retreat. This is a tactical consolidation." But everyone in the command post knew the truth. This was a defeat, and it was a defeat that revealed something more disturbing than the loss of one battle. The Americans had not won through superior tactics or technology. They had won through sheer overwhelming abundance. They had used tanks the way someone might use ammunition, firing until the target was destroyed, accepting losses as an inevitable cost of doing business, never concerned about conservation, because there was always more available. As Weber supervised the withdrawal, moving through positions where his troops were preparing to pull back, he observed something that would stay with him forever. An American Sherman, damaged by a German anti-tank round but still operational, had stopped near the German lines. The crew evacuated, standard procedure for a damaged vehicle. But 15 minutes later, Weber watched through binoculars as an American recovery vehicle arrived, hooked up to the damaged tank and towed it away toward repair facilities. And behind that recovery vehicle came a replacement Sherman, fresh from the staging area, moving forward to fill the gap left by the damaged vehicle. The entire process took less than 30 minutes. Zimmermann, watching the same scene, spoke quietly. "They treat their tanks like parts in a factory line. Break one, replace it, continue production. We treat our vehicles like precision instruments that must be carefully maintained because we have so few. They have changed the nature of armored warfare, and we are still fighting the last war." The withdrawal took all night, a carefully conducted retrograde movement that preserved most of Weber's remaining personnel, even though much of his equipment had to be abandoned or destroyed. By dawn, his regiment had established positions 10 kilometers behind their original line, a temporary refuge that everyone understood would only last until the Americans decided to advance again. Weber sat in a new command post, another commandeered farmhouse, this one still intact but already showing signs of hasty military occupation. His staff was assessing losses and preparing reports for division headquarters. The final count was devastating. In 3 days of fighting, Weber's regiment had been reduced from 11 operational armored vehicles to 2, 1 medium tank and 1 self-propelled gun. His anti-tank gun strength had been cut by over 60%. Personnel casualties had been relatively light, only because Weber had ordered withdrawal before his units could be completely encircled. But the loss of equipment meant his regiment existed now largely on paper, a command structure, without adequate means to command anything significant. But the material losses, while severe, were not what kept Weber awake that night, as he sat alone with his journal. What disturbed him was the realization that had been forced upon him through direct experience. The Americans had not demonstrated superior tanks or superior tactics. They had demonstrated something far more powerful and far more terrifying: the ability to absorb losses that would cripple any European army and simply continue operations without pause. They had revealed a form of warfare that did not depend on the skill of individual commanders or the technical specifications of individual weapons, but on the raw productive capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Weber wrote in his journal that night, and his words captured the fundamental transformation in his understanding. I called their tanks tin cans. I believed that our tactical excellence and superior equipment would prevail, but I have learned in these 3 days what should have been obvious from the beginning. The Americans are not fighting a military campaign in the European sense. They are conducting an industrial operation. Every tank we destroy is simply a number on a production report that will be replaced next month. Every loss they take is already calculated into their strategic planning. We are artisans fighting against a factory, and the factory does not care how many products are rejected in quality control as long as the production line keeps moving. He paused, staring at the candle flame that provided his writing light. Then he added one more paragraph. If Germany had possessed 100,000 of the finest armored vehicles ever designed, each one a masterpiece of engineering, we would still lose this conflict, because the Americans would produce 200,000 adequate vehicles and overwhelm us through sheer weight of numbers. This is not warfare as we understood it. This is something new, and we have no answer for it. Over the following weeks, Weber's regiment received replacement equipment, a few vehicles transferred from other units, some outdated models pulled from reserve depots. His division commander visited and praised Weber's tactical handling of the withdrawal, but Weber found no satisfaction in such praise. He had inflicted significant losses on an enemy that did not consider such losses significant. Intelligence reports crossed his desk, describing American supply operations. Photographs showed supply depots that stretched for kilometers, repair facilities that could restore damaged vehicles in days rather than weeks. Reports from prisoners described an American logistics system so efficient that frontline troops sometimes complained about having too much equipment. Müller, who had survived the battle and remained with the regiment, came to Weber one evening with a question that had been bothering him. "Sir, with respect, do our superiors understand what we are facing? Do they grasp that we are not losing battles because of tactical failures, but because we are attempting to fight an industrial power with a European military? Can they not see what is obvious to everyone at this level?" Weber considered the question carefully before responding. His answer, when it came, was measured and thoughtful. Some understand. Some refuse to understand because accepting the truth would require admitting that this conflict cannot be won through military means. Others understand but believe that sufficient determination and tactical skill can overcome material disadvantage. And some, I think, simply do not have the intellectual framework to comprehend warfare on this scale. They were trained, as I was trained, to think about battles and campaigns and tactical objectives. The Americans think about production capacity and logistics and industrial output. We are speaking different languages, fighting different kinds of wars, and only one of those approaches is suited to modern industrialized conflict. As winter deepened and the front lines stabilized temporarily, Weber had time to reflect on his experiences and observations. He began writing longer analyses in his journal, not just tactical notes, but strategic assessments of the broader conflict. His writings showed a man grappling with the implications of everything he had witnessed. He wrote about the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that could afford to be wasteful, that treated expensive military equipment as if it were expendable. He wrote about the gradual erosion of morale that came from winning tactical engagements but losing strategic ground. Most significantly, he wrote about the fundamental mismatch between a military culture based on efficiency and conservation, facing an industrial power that had weaponized abundance itself. In February of 1945, Weber received orders transferring him to a staff position at division headquarters. His regiment, reduced to barely company strength, was being merged with another unit. The transfer was presented as a promotion, recognition of his tactical skills and leadership under difficult circumstances, but Weber understood it for what it really was, an admission that his regiment no longer existed as an effective fighting force and that his expertise was needed in planning rather than execution. On his last day with the regiment, Weber gathered his remaining officers for a final briefing. The meeting had no official purpose, no tactical decisions to make. It was simply a moment to acknowledge what they had experienced together. Zimmermann was there, promoted to major and given command of the merged unit. Miller was there, looking older than his 26 years should allow. A few other officers who had survived the constant attrition of winter fighting attended as well. Weber spoke to them, not as a commander giving orders, but as a teacher sharing lessons learned. "Gentlemen, I will not insult your intelligence by pretending we have been victorious in these recent months. We have fought well. We have conducted tactical operations with skill and determination. But we have learned, or should have learned, that in modern industrialized warfare, traditional military virtues are not enough. The enemy we face does not win through superior tactics or training or equipment. They win through superior production, superior logistics, and the willingness to accept losses that would be considered catastrophic by any European military standard." He paused, looking at each officer in turn. "I was wrong about their tanks. I called them tin cans, believing that our superior engineering would prevail, but I failed to understand that in this kind of conflict, quantity has its own quality. A tank that is adequate but available in unlimited numbers is more strategically valuable than a tank that is excellent but available in limited quantities." The Americans understood this principle before the conflict began. We are only learning it now, when it is too late to apply the lesson. Zimmermann asked the question everyone was thinking. So what do? We are soldiers. We have our orders. We understand the strategic situation is difficult, but we must continue fighting. What would you have us do differently? Weber considered the question carefully before responding. Continue to do your duty. Preserve your men where possible. Fight with intelligence rather than determination alone. And remember that your true value is not in destroying enemy equipment. They have more equipment than we can ever destroy. But in preserving the lives of your soldiers for whatever comes after this conflict ends. Every man who survives represents knowledge and experience that will be needed to rebuild. That is perhaps the most important mission you have now, though it is not one anyone will officially acknowledge. Weber left his regiment 3 days later and took up his new staff position at division headquarters. The work was different, planning defensive operations, coordinating between units, analyzing intelligence reports, but the underlying reality remained the same. Every report that crossed his desk confirmed what he had learned through direct experience. The Americans and their allies possessed such overwhelming material superiority that German tactical excellence could only delay, never prevent the inevitable outcome. Production reports showed American factories producing more aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year. Logistics assessments revealed American supply lines that could sustain offensive operations indefinitely, while German forces struggled with basic ammunition and fuel shortages. In April of 1945, as the final collapse accelerated, Weber was given one last field assignment. He was ordered to assess defensive positions and recommend whether certain areas could be held or should be evacuated. He traveled extensively, visiting units that existed more as organizational concepts than actual fighting forces. He saw veterans of years of combat, skilled and determined soldiers, trying to hold positions with inadequate weapons, insufficient ammunition, and no hope of reinforcement. He saw the final stage of a military force that had been systematically ground down by an opponent that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The conflict in Europe ended in May of 1945. Weber, by that time, was no longer serving in a field position. He spent the final weeks of the conflict in administrative duties, helping to process the surrender of units and ensure that the transition to occupation proceeded in an orderly manner. In the chaos of those final days, his journal was one of the few possessions he managed to keep with him through the confusion of surrender and the beginning of occupation. After the conflict ended, Weber spent time in a processing camp where former military personnel were documented and assessed. During this period, he had extensive conversations with men from all theaters of operation. Officers who had faced American forces described the same experience: tactical victories that meant nothing strategically, enemy losses that were immediately replaced. The realization that had come to Weber during those 3 days in December had become universal understanding. Weber eventually returned to civilian life, taking a position teaching history at a small university. He used the experiences and insights from his wartime journals to inform his teaching. His lectures on modern warfare emphasized the transformation that industrialization had brought to conflict, the way that production capacity had become more important than traditional military factors. In his later years, Weber occasionally gave interviews to historians researching the conflict. He was always measured in his assessments, but he never wavered from the core insight forced upon him during those 3 days in December. The lesson was about the fundamental nature of industrial warfare, about what happened when one side could treat expensive military equipment as expendable while the other side had to conserve every asset. The Sherman tank, he would note, was not technically superior to its German counterparts in most specifications, but it had one overwhelming advantage: it existed in such quantities that American commanders could use them freely, accept losses without concern, and replace destroyed vehicles faster than the enemy could destroy them. That abundance had proven more decisive than any technological advantage. Weber lived until 1983, long enough to see how the lessons of industrial warfare had shaped the post-conflict world. His journal, preserved in his personal effects, was eventually donated to a military archive where it became a valuable source for historians. The entries from those 3 days in December, where he described watching American Shermans advance in endless waves, were frequently cited in studies of industrial warfare. The story of Friedrich Weber, the German commander who learned that calling enemy tanks tin cans was not an assessment of their combat effectiveness, but a failure to understand modern warfare, represents a broader transformation in military history. It illustrates the moment when traditional military values, courage, tactical skill, technical excellence, became secondary to industrial capacity and logistical organization. The Sherman tanks that Weber had dismissed were indeed vulnerable, mechanically imperfect, and individually inferior to many of their opponents. But they existed in such overwhelming numbers that their individual shortcomings became irrelevant compared to their collective impact. The 3 days in December, when Weber's understanding of warfare was systematically dismantled by waves of American armor, represented more than a tactical defeat. They represented the end of a way of thinking about military conflict, the final demonstration that in the industrial age wars were won not on battlefields but in factories, not through tactical brilliance but through production capacity, not by destroying enemy equipment but by replacing your own losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Weber had joked about tin cans, but he had learned that in modern warfare, having 1,000,000 tin cans was more valuable than having 1,000 masterpieces of engineering. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.